Hi, welcome to the fourth and final part of my story about processors that I bought as leftovers from a computer repair shop. Today I'm gonna deal with Socket 7, Super Socket 7 and some early Socket 370. But first, I have a confession to make. Remember those two Celeron from the first part? Well, I lost them. I straightened their pins at the very beginning, hid them in a safe place, and forgot where. Knowing my luck, they will turn up right after this episode is published. Sorry about that. Alright, that's off my chest. Let's move on to the processors that I haven't had lost. I will start with the Socket 7 platform. As usual, I will begin by presenting the motherboard. The PC partner VXB820DS. The motherboard should support everything I have here today and is based on the well-known Intel 430VX chipset. Note those chips located directly above the socket. This is level 2 cache, because in those days it was located on the motherboard, not inside the CPU as it is today. And the cache on the motherboard isn't the only weirdness here. The Socket 7 platform is a historic milestone in terms on how home PCs were built and used, and I will try to demonstrate this today. The first thing is the layout of the motherboard. It is so-called AT standard form factor. For comparison, I have another motherboard here, but in the ATX standard, more or less the same as the one still in use today in 2025. This board is also Socket 7 and has very similar capabilities. The power connector would also fit a contemporary power supply, unlike the AT. And at the back we have a set of peripheral connectors, of which only USB and perhaps a single PS2 for the keyboard remain today. The AT motherboard also has these connectors, but only the keyboard socket is on the PCB and the rest require dongles, which create clutter and take up slots intended for expansion cards. Good riddance. Socket 7 was the last platform when the AT standard prevailed over the ATX, and this is a turning point as the AT standard originated from the original IBM PC designs. The name comes from IBM PC AT, but the dimensions and connector layout were already defined in its predecessor, the IBM PC XT. I don't have the real thing, but I have a very similar IBM PC XT clone. That's how it was originally organized, and many things were duplicated until the second half of the 90s. The keyboard connector, standard dimensions, card slots location, and power connectors. The transition from AT to ATX had also another significant outcome. Computers gained the ability to turn themselves on and off, because before that, the power switch simply cut off the mains grid to the power supply unit. This is why Windows on AT motherboards displayed this message after shutting down the system. Okay, let's finally get something moving. First up are 4 late Pentium 1s, clocked somewhere around 200 MHz. As you can see, I have both version with and without MMX. Cool. Okay, let's put everything together. more jumpers and I'm ready for the first smoke test. C6. Looks and sounds like a memory problem? Oh, yes indeed. I installed the module at an angle. Almost got a real smoke here. These memory slots seems to be very cheap, but that doesn't excuse me. Fortunately nothing bad happened. Let's go. For testing, I will use DOS benchmark pack from philscomputerslab.com. A very handy tool. Thank you, Phil. So I will start with Doom, which, although is more of a challenge for 486 class machines, will allow me to demonstrate something. Yeah, I loved that game back then and I love it today. Although I have to admit that I was young enough at the time to be a little bit scared of it when I was playing. The funny thing was that my parents were glad I was playing Doom, because the alternative was the Wolfenstein 3D, and in that game, after all, you shoot people. Yeah, 90s were cool. Okay, give me a moment to test my CPUs and prepare some performance charts. And here they are. As I said, Doom is no challenge for Pentium, as we had over 70 FPS here. The MMX versions performs better, but that's because they have a twice as much cache memory. MMX instructions are not implemented in Doom, and even if they were, their role would be to support multimedia processing rather than the game itself. There is also something interesting here. Two of the Pentiums are marked as 233 MHz, but the one on the left is detected by all my motherboards as a 200 version. The properly functioning CPU on the right has a slightly convex resin patch and the inscriptions are clearly noticeable under the finger. The other one is completely flat, has what looks like grinding marks, and the inscriptions cannot be felt. I remember that in those days scammers used to do things like this to sell a cheaper version as a more expensive one, and I think that is exactly the case here. I'm not even mad, just another tale from the 90s. Okay, all Pentiums are good, time to test the AMD K5. But wait, an AMD processor on an Intel chipset based motherboard, the same one used for Intel CPUs? Yes. Intel and AMD once used the same motherboards, and Socket 7 is the last stop before the division of platforms that we know today. Why was that? We have to go back to the early 80s when IBM was designing its first IBM PC. The home computer boom was just beginning and IBM had to act quickly if it wanted to enter the game. Unusually for itself, it decided to use off-the-shelf parts and make the specifications widely available in order to create what we would call today an ecosystem. The key decision was the choice of CPU. The x86 family was chosen, more specifically Intel 8088. However, IBM was rightly concerned about becoming dependent on Intel, so as a part of the agreement, Intel was forced to make its technology available to a third-party manufacturer. That manufacturer was no one else but AMD. Intel complied with this agreement but was clearly very unhappy with it. Let's look at the timeline. First, in 1979, Intel released the 8088 and stole IBM's heart with it. The cooperation started well, with AMD beginning mass production of 8088 clones in early 1982. In the same year, Intel released the 286 processor, but deliberately delayed the transfer of documentation. It took another 2 years for AMD to release its 286. However, the real trouble began with 386. The IBM PC ecosystem slipped out of IBM's hands to countless clone manufacturers, and Intel wanted the whole pie for itself. Intel did not provide AMD with key documentation, and when AMD reverse engineered it, Intel began harassing AMD with lawsuits. The ongoing trial secured Intel's monopoly. Time passed and the release of the 486 left AMD even further behind. The court battle ended in the 90s and AMD finally broke nearly 5 years monopoly on 386. It would seem that in 1991 the game was already over, but that was not the case at all. The prices demanded by Intel were so high that it was only the arrival of AM386 that caused the explosion of affordable designs. The same phenomenon repeated itself with AM486. However, Intel had already released the Pentium, so it continued to have a lucrative part of the market all to itself. To stay competitive, AMD released processors with faster clock speed than Intel had settled for. This applied to both the 386 and the 486 as well. By the way, the 5x86 label on the AMD processor is pure marketing. It was plain 486, but in 1995 it was supposed to suggest it was a 5th generation processor just like Pentium. However, we didn't have to wait much longer for a true 5th generation processor from AMD. In 1996, the AMD K5 landed on the still new Socket 7 platform. The success of the K5 was questionable. On the one hand, it was no longer a clone, but a very ambitious project built from scratch. The ideas it contained were ahead of what Pentium had to offer, and it beat Intel clock for clock. On the other hand, internal complexity prevented it from achieving high clock speeds and taking advantage of its edge over Pentium. Intel remained the champion. Fortunately, my K5 works. So let's take a look at the performance chart. Well, despite its internal clock speed of only 116.7 MHz, the K5 performs quite good. So good that AMD began using the PR or performance rating designation. This K5 has a slightly worn but still readable PR166 marking. This means that it is equivalent to a Pentium 166 MHz, so I will treat it as such in the chart. I don't have the real Pentium equivalent in my box, but from the graph it looks like it could have very similar results, at least in Doom. Okay, now let's talk about the Cyrix MII-300GP. Yes, there used to be more x86 manufacturers than just Intel or AMD. Cyrix initially specialized in the production of mathematical coprocessors, so-called floating point units or FPUs for short. What were they? Early x86 processors did not have specialized circuits for floating point calculations, so they were done painfully slow on the software side. However, if you needed them to be fast, you could buy an FPU and install it on the motherboard next to the CPU. FPUs were very expensive though, and mostly only specialized engineering or scientific software utilized them. For ordinary users, they were rather useless. The situation began to change with the 486 processor, whose DX version included a built-in FPU and enabled its wider adoption. This essentially eliminated the FPU market for Cyrix, so it entered the CPU market instead. Of course, Intel took legal action, but Cyrix designed everything from scratch and was also fabless. This meant that they outsourced production to other manufacturers who conveniently had cross-licenses for x86 tech. A legal nightmare that ended in favor of Cyrix. Alright, let's test this beast. It's missing one pin, but it's just one of many ground pins, so it should be fine. Yay, it works! Although the motherboard is older than the CPU, so it reports it as a PR266 instead of PR300. A BIOS update might help, but it doesn't matter. And how does it look on the graph? Well, despite the actual clock speed of 222 MHz, the PR300 seems to deliver more or less what it promises. At least in Doom. Remember how I said that FPU were rather useless for ordinary users? Well, that changed in the days of Socket 7 thanks to the first fully 3D games. Starting with Pentium, a built-in FPU became standard, but it quickly became apparent that its performance also mattered. Let's look at the graphs for Quake 1, which is also included in the DOS benchmark pack. And here, performance rating can be thrown out the window. Pentium's floating point performance was unmatched. While this was true, Quake was a little unfair because its software squeezed the Pentium like a lemon, even exceeding the official documentation. Regardless, the word got out. You wanted 3D games? You needed a Pentium. Socket 7 changed a lot, and above all, it showed that Intel no longer had such a crushing advantage over the competition as before. As a result, it decided to change the rules of the game. Intel abandoned Socket 7 and kept the new platform for Pentium 2 exclusively for itself. And it worked. Newly established CPU manufacturers were unable to bear the burden of creating new platforms on their own. Only AMD survived the mass extinction intact. K5 was an ambitious project but turned out to be a dead end. In 1995, AMD acquired NextGen, a company that also produced x86 compatible processors but on its own completely niche platform. It's an interesting story in itself, but one for another episode. What is important today is that K6 was developed based on NextGen core and K5 was dumped. K6 proved to be a lifesaver because although the first models were chasing Pentium MMX, their improved version were already trying to keep up with Pentium 2. To survive Intel's maneuver, AMD developed something called Super Socket 7 platform. It was a cheap extension of the standard Socket 7 with a 100 MHz system clock, support for lower CPU voltages, and usually an AGP port for GPUs. Of course, Intel chipsets were out of question, but other manufacturers were eager to cooperate. Okay, there were 3 K6-2s in my box, clocked at 380, 400 and 500 MHz. I hope they are working and ready to take on Intel. Memory? Again? Okay, I'm the stupid one again. This board simply doesn't support 128 MB modules. As a bonus, my Riva TNT GPU died, so I replaced it with Riva TNT 2. After a long installation and several driver-related restarts, I thought I was ready. But then... See those horizontal glitches? They always appeared when Sun Blaster played sound. I tried other drivers, reallocating system resources, but it ended up like this. Yeah, the creative plug-and-play card was my first choice because I didn't want to mess around with drivers or problems. It is what it is. Quake 2 seemed like the natural choice for this stage of testing. I even found the original CD that came with CD Action magazine, so I didn't have to use the GOG version as usual. By the way, I forgot how cool CD installers looked like. But after 10 minutes, my nostalgia evaporated. Yay! The game finally booted. But it quickly turned out that I can no longer ignore the instability of the system. Of course, it's not that I didn't try. But apart from instability, performance was also hopeless, and I felt like these two issues were connected. The drivers were the first suspects, especially since they were the same drivers that has been already bothering me with Soltec in the previous episode. However, before I start tinkering with them and probably making things worse, I sensibly checked system performance under the DOS and... yeah, the 500 K6 achieved a worse result than the 200 MHz Pentium on the previous motherboard. For a few evenings I changed memories, GPUs, CPUs, BIOS settings, even the power supply. Finally I remembered my friend's saying, when everything else fails, read the user manual. And I found the purpose of two jumpers there, which were not explained by the PCB imprints. They allowed you to choose whether the memory was clocked by the AGP clock or the system clock. This was intended to enable the use of cheaper 66 MHz memory with a 100 MHz system clock, but in my case, it caused instability and extremely poor performance. I don't know why, maybe it's some kind of defect or maybe it's just poor design of a budget board, who knows. The important thing is that the system has become stable enough that I could even set aggressive timing for the memory. However, performance improved from extremely poor to slightly disappointing. K6 finally started showing something sensible and managed to break 70 FPS barrier. However, Super Socket 7 also supports regular Socket 7 processors and look what turned out. Those are the Super Socket 7 results. And these are the results of the previous motherboard based on the Intel chipset. Sad. But unfortunately, this is to be expected. In the meantime, I came across this archived article from Tom's Hardware's Guide. See for yourself. Remember to always read reviews before buying. Otherwise, you might get scammed. Okay, let's get back to the Quake 2. First I ran it with software renderer similar to Quake 1. Just like before, all the hard work here is done by the CPU. Then I will switch to the OpenGL renderer where much of the effort is taken on by the GPU. Or rather by the 3D accelerator as we called them back then. As you can probably see, the difference wasn't just about performance. This is how RTX on and off effect looked like in the second half of the 90s. And here we have the results for software mode on the chart. They look rather poor, although the game seemed to be quite playable even on a Pentium. Maybe it's a matter of how frames are counted? I don't know. And here are the results for OpenGL. Lines and dots look similar, but the frame rates are much higher. The K6 even exceeds 40 FPS. However, I'm more interested in how these results compare to my Intel Celerons. So let's move on. So it's time for, fortunately, the last processors I have left in this series of episodes. Let's start by taking another look at my timeline. We stopped at K5 last time, but that's not the end of the story. A little over a year after AMD took its first step into 5th generation processors, Intel introduced its first 6th generation home processors called Pentium 2. It had excellent performance, of course, but its appearance was also impressive. Its size, cartridge-like design, and hologram captured the imagination. The message was clear. Slot processors are the future, and sockets like those used by the competition are the thing of the past. But of course, apart from the appearance, technical reasons were also important. Remember when I mentioned the L2 cache located on the Socket 7 motherboard? It was already possible to place it inside of the processor, but it was very expensive. Intel therefore placed it on the processor module board, running it at half the speed of CPU. Another year passed and AMD introduced the K6-2, the very one I had just tested. It wasn't a bad processor at all, but let's be honest, it was clearly outperformed by the Pentium 2. And by the way, Cyrix MII, which I also showed, debuted at almost the same time. It was just too late for a race. Intel continued to call the shots, but as always, with great power comes a steep price. And something interesting happened. Because you know how it is. I realized that there are fast and luxurious cars available on the market. However, this knowledge did not affect me at all when I bought my Honda Civic. The same thing happened here. Intel began to lose lower markets to much cheaper competitors. Intel had to do something about it quickly, and it did. Just before the launch of K6-2, it introduced a cheaper version of Pentium 2 and called it Celeron. Did you notice the lack of cache chips? The first Celeron, codenamed Covington, was simply a Pentium 2 without L2 cache. An interesting idea, but performance-wise, it was a disaster. A few months later, Intel improved and released a similarly priced Celeron codenamed Mendocino. There are still no cache chips here, but that's because Intel placed the L2 cache inside of the processor. This meant that the reason for using the slot module had just vanished and Intel returned to sockets, starting with socket 370 for Mendocino Celerons. Alright, time for the last motherboard today. Once again I choose something budget friendly, as befits a motherboard dedicated to Celeron processors. I have quite a pile of processors to check, so I'm getting down to work. See you later. And I'm done. Oddly enough, this time everything just worked. I have no miseries to speak of. Strange. What's more, all the processors turn out to be in working order. This means that apart from the two lost Celerons, there were no broken processors in this episode. Nice. Okay, there was one bummer though. Judging by the motherboard label and this website, I expected an Intel 440BX chipset. What I got instead was chipset from VIA. So, this motherboard. It's my fault for not paying enough attention, but I still feel mildly scammed. Other than that, I have no complaints. Let's look at the charts. Let's start with Quake. What came out is completely different from what I expected. Celeron has superior FPU, so it should crush K6. I looked for answers, but all I found were suggestions that higher resolutions would reveal the true winner. Unfortunately, for some reason Quake on my Super Socket 7 motherboard didn't want to work on it and fell back to lower one. I don't know what to say. Except that I don't like this motherboard and it probably doesn't like me either. Okay, now Quake 2 in software renderer mode. Celeron took the lead, but again there is no expected crashing victory here. However, I may have an explanation for this. AMD was well aware of the weakness of its FPU, so it introduced the 3D Now instruction set to its processors. It was similar to MMX but aimed at 3D graphics calculations. Quake 2 implemented this, which may be why the K6 is able to keep up. Okay, last chart for today, the OpenGL renderer. Celeron finally outperformed K6, but again I didn't quite expect that. I thought that in this mode it would depend more on the GPU than CPU, but apparently that's not the whole story. The explanation that comes to mind is the well-known poor HGP implementation on Super Socket 7 motherboards. At this stage, however, I'm no longer sure of anything. Mendocino Celerons were an extremely successful product. They weren't just a cut-down version of Pentium 2 because they had a modified design, faster cache and a separate socket. So I like to think of them as a distinct family of processors alongside the Pentium 2 and Pentium Pro. Their capabilities were very high and probably higher than Intel itself would have liked. It quickly became apparent that many Celerons could easily handle overclocking the system clock from 66 to 100 MHz. In practice, that meant that this processor fought on equal terms with that processor. Fortunately for Intel though, my motherboard refused to cooperate in the overclocking department, so I will leave that for another time. And so my video adventure with a box full of processors finally comes to an end. Everything you see on the screen has passed the test and will be added to my collection. All that remains is for me to answer the question in the title. Was it a good idea? I think yes, but there were moments when I regretted getting myself into this. I'm glad that I will finally be able to record a video about something else. Until then, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.